Okay, this is wild. So,
tapeworm, parasitic barnacle.
They love their meat saignant, literally bleeding.
I saw one statistic where doctors checked people who came into hospital emergency rooms, victims of high-speed motorcycle accidents, which means they're engaging in risky behavior, and they had a much higher infection rate than. But I know you brought some slides with you. Let's talk about zombie ants.
Okay.
Zombie ants, tapeworm, parasitic barnacles. Oh my God.
Okay. These are zombie ants. These ants have picked up spores, fungal spores, on the ground.
In Florida.
And these spores then hatch and they burrow into the ant.
Weird.
There's nothing docile about these spores. They immediately start wildly proliferating inside the ant, and they begin churning out chemicals that tell the ant to go to the nearest sapling and at exactly solar noon to climb 1 foot up from the ground, and then go to the underside of a leaf on the northwestern quadrant of the plant.
I wish my students listened to me that perfect.
And to lock onto the main vein of the leaf. And then, like in the iconic scene in Alien, the fungus sprouts from its head. It grows this long stalk with fruiting bodies, 1 or 2, and then those explode, raining spores down on more ants who are passing by below, creating, new armies of zombie ants. And this is not a rare phenomenon. It wasn't discovered until about, I think, 2005, 2008, which is very surprising because in rainforests around the world, you can find many of them, like about 20 or so per square yard. So they're a very important part of our ecosystem, these zombie ants. Now I will show you another. What you're looking at here are tiny brine shrimp gathered together into swarms. Brine shrimp, they've gathered together. They're swarming together. Brine shrimp are like spindly little shrimp. They're not much longer than my fingernail. And they're normally translucent.
Yeah.
But when a tapeworm invades the shrimp, it turns its normally translucent host bright pink. And it then
bright pink
encourages it to socialize with other shrimp. So all the infected shrimp gather together and they form these bright red clouds in the water that can be as much as 1 meter or so wide. This is very nice for flamingos because they feed on these shrimp. So all they need to do is, dip their ladle-shaped beak into this red seafood broth at their feet, and they've gotten a mouth full of shrimp. The flamingo, as you've probably guessed by now, is the parasite's next host.
Jesus.
And the one of the scientists who studied this phenomenon, his name is Nicholas Rode, he said, we really have to rethink what we observe in nature, because he said normally when we see animals in herds or flocks or shoals, we assume that they're gathering together for their own benefit, to fend off predators or maybe to help them be more effective foraging, or perhaps to find a sexual mate. But he said perhaps far more often than we realize, parasites may be hurting hurting their current host straight into the jaws of their next host. This looks like a crab, right? It's really, believe it or not, a barnacle that is masquerading as a crab.
There you go.
This is not really a crab. suspend any preconceived notions you have about barnacles, because this barnacle is exceedingly iconoclastic. What it does is it alights on a crab, and then it injects a tiny clump of its cells into the crab. And then those cells start growing into a dense tangle of roots that wraps around all of the crab's internal organs. Now, while this is happening, the crab is behaving just like any normal crab. It will be, trolling the shoreline, munching on mollusks. But all the food that it gathers is basically fueling, the overthrow of its rule. Because the parasitic barnacle eventually sterilizes the crab. And where the crab would normally grow a brood pouch on its underbelly to incubate its young, the parasitic barnacle, it pushes out outside what it does is it grows a brood pouch of its own in exactly the same spot. So that yellow bladder-shaped organ that you see in the picture on the underside of the crab, that's actually filled with the parasite's young. And when they're ready to be born, the crab will go into deep water and it will bob up and down, releasing them in great pulses, and it will stir the water with its claws to send them on their way so that they can commandeer the minds and bodies of more crabs. And you might think these parasitic barnacles to be very rare, but they're not, in fact. And this is one of the big surprises about parasitic manipulators. About 20% of the crabs in Danish fjords have been colonized by this parasitic barnacle. In Hawaii, about half of the crabs have been colonized by these parasitic barnacles. They are robo-crabs. And in some parts of the Mediterranean, 100% of the crabs are really this parasitic barnacle. They're being controlled by this parasitic barnacle, like an amphibious robot, basically.
That's crazy.
A few more interesting examples.
Oh, is this the hammock?
This is the spider.
This is my favorite.
God. Wait, this is too familiar. What is this?
Okay, what you're looking at here,
Is
you see a
what?
spider on the left-hand side of the screen. I don't know if you can see it, but there is a tiny little white glob on one side of the spider.
Yeah, oh, I see it.
And that is the egg of a parasitic wasp. The
Oh, we
wasp
got
attached
wasps
it there,
everywhere,
and
too.
as the egg develops into a little larva, it produces a lot of chemicals. And these chemicals tell the spider to build the wasp basically a custom design nursery.
What?
So the spider
What?
abandons its normal weaving style. And in this case, you can see that the normal weaving style is in the center. And to the far right, you can see a pretty crazy looking web.
What's amazing to me is that is not a simple change of behavior.
No,
that
it's
is
not.
a complex web design being turned into basically a hammock over there. That's unbelievable. That's a lot of brain chemistry changes going
Yeah,
on.
It is all
It is.
connected,
And the
isn't it?
scientists who study this are absolutely
Baffled?
dumbfounded by how the parasitic wasp, how that larvae can communicate such fine instructions to the spider to elicit
That's
that
nuts.
kind of behavior. And in fact, the wasp actually goads the spider into producing a decorative motif in the center of the web, which camouflages the wasp's larva from its enemies.
So, there's more.
I'm not
Yeah.
sure if there's more, but let me see.
Oh, that's the
No,
next
that's
part.
the next part.
There's plenty more in the first part of the book that she didn't mention that I really think you should check out. There's zombie roaches,
Oh,
and
my
there's
God. Beetles?
suicidal grasshoppers that jump into
Whoa.
pools and all sorts of
Whoa.
other stuff. But right before the second part of the book, you take a break from parasites and you go into our own microbiome, our biome, the flora of our own guts. And could you take a moment to explain that the importance that scientists are finding in the bacteria. 9 out of every 10 of your cells are not human cells.
Whoa.
You are a community. And so have a look, explain that, because that is...
Yes. Okay. The bacteria in your gut, I don't want to give you the impression that they're parasites, but I included them in my book because it's an example of how our behavior can be manipulated unbeknownst to ourselves by another organism. The bacteria in our gut, some of them produce 1, 2, or more neurotransmitters. They're exactly identical to the neurotransmitters found in your brain. And through a variety of mechanisms, they can influence our behavior. So our behavior is not just governed from the top down, but literally from the bottom up. And another way that they can influence our behavior is when the bacteria are breaking down the food that we eat, they can produce psychoactive compounds that can also act on our brain. So there's a variety of different ways they influence our behavior. But scientists now think that to varying degrees, the bacteria in your gut determine whether you're happy or sad, anxious or calm, energetic or sluggish, or even by helping to regulate the hormones that your own body produces to control your appetite. They may even determine whether you're fat or thin, or at least weigh in on the matter.
So you have the experiment in your book about the mice where they took the gut flora of an obese mouse and put it in a skinny mouse and vice versa. And the obese mouse actually lost weight with the gut flora of the thin mouse, which is unbelievable.
Yeah, and they've done something comparable.
Much for exercise. Switch bacteria.
Yeah.
Wow.
They've done something comparable. They've taken their strains of mice that have different kinds of personalities. And scientists can rear animals in such a way that they're born completely free of their normal gut microflora. And what they've done is they've transferred bacteria that's normally found in one strain into another strain. And in this way, they've been able to basically transplant personalities. So the recipient displays a personality that's more typical of the donor. So if the donor is like more aggressive and gregarious, then the mouse that receives it will be that way, even though it might normally have been a more, much less aggressive and not as social. So you can get this swapping of personalities. There's one other thing that I think is very interesting about gut bacteria, and scientists discovered this again by studying animals that don't have the normal microflora, and they are very strange creatures. So a normal mouse, for example, with a normal gut microbiota is an eager learner, very curious. If you put a napkin ring in its cage, it will circle it and sniff it with great interest. When you put them in a maze, it's keen to explore new arms of the maze. Well, the same mouse, the same strain of mouse without the normal gut microbiota is not very curious. It's a slow learner. It doesn't remember where it's been, and it doesn't avoid wide open spaces and brightly lit areas, which would scream danger to a normal mouse. And it isn't even distressed when it's separated from its mother early in life, which normally if you separate a mouse from its mother, it will protest. They cry. But you don't see any of that behavior in the animals that are free of bacteria. So clearly, the bacteria in our gut have a big impact on our behavior.
Wow. I think we could all think about the many repercussions that could have in our own worlds and medicine and psychology and everything. So that's, basically the first half of the book is what parasites do to us. And then the second half of the book if you consider that animals, including humans, have been evolving with these parasites for millions of years, it's called coevolution. We've evolved very complex defense behaviors or defense mechanisms to fight off these parasites. And so the second half of Kathleen's book is even more interesting, I think. And could you go into and talks more about humans, the second half of the book. What kind of complex behavioral defenses have we evolved to fight off these marauding hordes of parasites?
First off, a lot of us have a mental shield against parasites that few of us know we possess. And scientists call it our behavioral immune system. And the way it works is like this. As you're basically moving about your environment, a part of your mind is scanning your surroundings for signs of contaminants, grimy fingerprints, gum stuck to the side of a desk, garbage on the floor.
Dog poo.
Yeah, dog poop,
rotting
for sure.
Food.
Yeah, rancid odors. When this part of our brain spots contaminants, it raises our disgust level and causes us to withdraw from the threat. A lot of the time, we're not even conscious of the fact that we're doing this. One of my favorite studies was done in a supermarket, and it found that shoppers are less likely to buy food, even goodies like cookies, if they come within 1 inch of touching products that we associate with filth, bodily waste. So, for example, diapers or tampons or garbage bags. Another example of it, you see these slides here, you can see that if you ask people, there was a study actually done there were over 100 participants in this study because it was done by a British researcher named Valerie Curtis in collaboration with the BBC. At any rate, they mixed up a whole bunch of pictures of this sort, and they had people rank them based on how disgusting they found them. And people all over the world ranked the sides.
They look almost like they've been cut with, I was going to say perforated scissors. That's not right, but shinking shears. They always got this fucking shit. And they always have a hair-like thing. So let's continue because I don't fully know.
On the left-hand side as more disgusting. As you can see, those pictures, they're more disease salient, if you will. This fellow, he looks like he might have a fever and maybe a rash on his face, for example.
Yeah.
So our minds are constantly scanning for contaminants. And one thing that's particularly interesting about our behavioral immune system is that it pays very close attention to other people because we are leading sources of infection.
Of influence and influenza.
But because our behavioral immune system is not guided by sophisticated reasoning, it can lock onto any abnormality, contagious or not.
There you go.
So, for example, it will trigger disgust if it locks onto a snotty nose or an oozing eye. But it can also trigger disgust in response to acne or a prominent mole or even excess body fat. So it's a very crudely calibrated system.
Wow.
And another aspect about the behavioral immune system that is a little strange is that especially if we're in an unsanitary environment or we're prompted to think about germs, it can trigger feelings of repulsion towards groups that we perceive to be of a different race or ethnicity. And one of the reasons scientists speculate this happens is because over our long history, people from faraway lands were more likely to carry germs for which the local population would have no natural resistance. So, they would be particularly virulent germs. And our behavioral immune system is also disgusted by people who break societal norms.
Ain't that the
Which is a
truth?
strange finding when you think about it.
It's so true, though.
But the reason the scientists theorize this happens actually, I think, makes quite a bit of sense,
It does to
which
me.
is that a lot of customs have the hidden function of protecting us from germs.
Good
So,
there.
for example, conservative sexual mores, washing before prayer, culinary practices,
Oh, those
only
things.
marrying within your religious group, bowing instead of handshaking. A lot of customs may have the function of keeping us safe from parasites.
Wow.
Which makes me think about one of the things that she mentions in the book that's very interesting to me is that the Torah that was written, thousands of years ago, can be considered in some ways the first medical text. Now, these people had no clue what a bacteria was or anything like that, but they knew which behaviors could protect them from sickness, basically.
That's
Yep.
right. Some of the world's most commonly practiced religions today, Judaism being a leading example, Hinduism is another, but they arose at a time when infectious disease was exploding. Hunter-gatherers do not get that many diseases. You have to have a certain size population before disease can spread like wildfire. And it was just at the point in time when populations in the Middle East and in a few other parts of the world were, increasing into, many millions, that you start to see this explosion of infectious disease and the birth of some of the first religions that are based where they emphasize moral behavior, following certain prescribed ways of behaving.
Interesting.
And Judaism, excuse me, is a particularly interesting example because, this is, of course, long before anybody knew the first thing about germ theory. The very rabbis were told, by God's decree, rabbis were told that they should wash their hands. And, rabbis are the main healers in their community, and washing hands is
That's super
perhaps the
important.
single most effective defense
Yeah,
against
that's
infectious disease
totally
that we
true.
know of even today.
Wow.
And there's other common admonitions in Judaism that are probably familiar to a lot of you, such as, not to eat pork, which can cause trichinosis, to circumcise sons, which is thought to probably protect against STDs and maybe urinary tract infections in infants. But there's actually just a whole bunch of other parts of the Torah that relate to infectious disease, so many that it's truly extraordinary. For example, early Jews were told to cover their wells, which is, a very good idea because it keeps
Yeah.
out insects and vermin. They were told that after using eating utensils, to put them in boiling water. They were told to not to eat any animal that had been felled by natural causes. And of course,
That's
such an
all of
animal
them.
may well have died of an infectious disease. And they were
Damn.
told to bury their dead within 2 or 3 days, just around the time that the corpse is about to decompose. And it gets even more involved than that. I mean, it's truly extraordinary, the full range of.
And to shun people who don't do these things kind of comes along with it hand in hand, too, right? To homeless people, or, so.
Yes, at a certain point, somehow parasites, if you will, became embedded in our morals. We shun people who
Have them.
break rules. And so a lot of those first rules related to infectious disease. But over time, we started to shun people that broke a much broader range of rules, societal rules. And when I say that parasites are sort of embedded in our morals, a very strange phenomenon is that when we are thinking about parasitic disease, we are much harsher in our judgment of anyone who even the most minor of transgressions. So not returning a stolen wallet, lying on your resume, or far more ethically fraught, turning to cannibalism to survive a plane crash in a remote area, all become more repugnant, more reprehensible if you're worried about infectious disease, or if you're in an unsanitary environment. Even like seemingly, harmless sex acts, like masturbating while clutching a teddy bear, or having sex in your grandmother's bed while she's, while you're house sitting for her, all become far more reprehensible if you're worried about infection.
Interesting.
The latter part of your book becomes a little bit more controversial as you start discussing societal tendencies, political tendencies, how politicians use our fear of foreign things that may, in our primitive brains, bring us infection. How do you feel about this? The controversial part of your book is probably bringing certain kinds of reviewers to your book, and tell them about the more controversial subjects that are involved here.
Sure. Okay, you can look away. All right, you've seen it. I guess I can go back to the other one. All right.
That's pretty bad too, actually.
Where's the coffee slide?
The more repulsed you are by that picture of the guy swallowing worms, the more likely you will hold conservative political beliefs. I know that sounds absolutely bizarre, but there's actually a lot of evidence that supports this.
You're telling me about the map today. The map with the disgust factor and then the voting map on top, and how there was a...
Yeah. I'll get into that in just a moment, but let's dissect what conservative values are really all about. First off, conservative sexual values. People who are conservative tend to be a little bit more ethnocentric. They stick with their own kinds. They're more likely to be opposed to immigration, for example. And there's a whole constellation of attitudes. You'll find that, for example, being anti-gay rights, a whole constellation of attitudes separate conservatives and liberals. And when you look at the most divisive issues, they're all about social behaviors with direct relevance to the transmission of disease.
Or what our crudely calibrated system considers.
Yes, that's a very important point to make, because obviously, that a lot of things that trigger our disgust sensitivity in no way pose any threat to us whatsoever. So, like somebody of a different ethnicity or whatever. No, you don't have to worry about that. But in the past, I guess because that's the way our minds are wired, we have a lot of aversions that are just the side effect of a crudely calibrated behavioral immune system. But there's actually been a lot of research done on this, and there was, for example, a study done in 2008 when it was the election between John McCain and Barack Obama. And the investigators looked at a nationally representative sample of people in every state, And they found that those who said that they were most likely to vote for John McCain, they tested highest of all on a standardized test of their disgust sensitivity. And then after the election, they looked at the average disgust sensitivity score of each state by like averaging all the respondents from that state, what their average disgust level was. And they could actually predict the proportion of votes that went to John McCain. And they subsequently conducted a much larger study of, I think it was 122 different nations, and they found that the same correlation between disgust sensitivity and conservative values. So there's a lot of research that makes this connection. It sounds crazy, but I think there's something to it.
Yeah, because I mean, millions of years ago, even hundreds of millions of years ago, or even just when Columbus came to South America, someone of another group can carry disease. Not the case anymore, but our brains are wired that way.
Yes, and of course we have antibiotics, so of course, sex is no longer as risky. Of course, it also helps to have birth control too. But obviously, this is a new phenomenon, and in the past, sex was actually one of the single riskiest things you could do.
Wow.
So, and in fact, interestingly, just a little factoid, is that lust suppresses disgust.
Yeah.
And this is very important, or we would have long ago gone extinct. Yeah. I mean, think about it. It's like serious mixing of bodily fluids. So.
And also, you're much more likely to share a toothbrush with your spouse because if they got germs, you probably got them at this point too, than with a stranger.
That's right. They've done a lot of research, and they've shown that, for example, people admire their own bowels, but needless to say, are repelled by others.
Yeah.
Or their baby's diapers don't stink as much as somebody else's baby's diapers. And as Bertha just pointed out, we would never share a toothbrush with a stranger. So yes. Another aspect of disgust that's interesting is women, I think, have long suspected they're more disgust sensitive than men. And indeed, research shows this is true. And probably the reason for it, it's theorized, is because women have the double burden of protecting both themselves and their young children from infection.
I know we're kind of going back a little bit, but some of the other behaviors that we've evolved to protect us, for example, sympathy vomiting. Could you talk about sympathy vomiting?
I gotta stop on that one real quick because when my mother was first pregnant with me, my dad was throwing up every morning. And so much so that my mom made an appointment for my dad to go to the doctor. And after explaining what my dad had been doing, the guy said, "Here, I want you to take a pregnancy test," to my mom. And my mom said, "I'm not the one having issues here." Long story short, sympathy pains. So my dad was throwing up every morning, like morning sickness. And I think that's what they're about to go into.
Bertha's particularly fond of this one. I'm not sure why.
It's amazing, but it's true.
It's called sympathetic vomiting.
Sympathetic,
Yeah.
excuse me.
No, but basically, if you see someone vomit, you're more likely to vomit too. I had a famous birthday party when I was a kid. When
We don't have to go there.
Okay. All right, we won't. I'll get to the point quickly. But basically, the reason probably we evolved sympathetic vomiting is because in generations past, food poisoning was far more common and lethal. So, imagine sitting around a primeval campfire, enjoying a communal meal of antelope stew, when the person next to you starts, retching, and maybe their illness has nothing to do with what's in their antelope, with the food they just ate. But it's still a smart thing for you to start vomiting too, because, better safe than sorry. So
Weird.
that's why scientists think this is why the phenomenon of sympathetic vomiting occurs. You get a head start in just ejecting all these nasty
Weird.
pathogens from your body.
Last question, and then maybe I'm sure you have questions, but I was thinking, we can't leave the room without kind of discussing this current political cycle that we're in at the moment, and how some politicians I don't think they actually have read this book and understand the evolution of our disgust reaction, but how it can be used, however crudely and incorrectly, to elicit our fears and perhaps our tendency to vote one way or the other. That was really well, subtly. You know exactly what I'm talking about.
And you notice that there was a certain person's name that she omitted mentioning. Yes, I think that certainly during the current election cycle, that parasites actually have, something to do with the nasty tenor of, these primaries, and how best to put it?
Eliciting fear, right? Eliciting our own fear of.
Right. I mean, basically, think about it. What are sort of some of the hot button topics right now? It's immigration, patrolling Muslim neighborhoods, on the sexual front, very conservative groups that, they're into virginity pledges, very anti-homosexuality. A lot of their morals may be sort of disgust-based, and politicians can capitalize on this. I mean, that's not to suggest that the reason people are anti-immigration is because they're worried about germs. No, I don't think that's the case. I mean, their first concern might be, that they're going to, foreigners are going to take the.
Guess they didn't want us to hear that. When was this? I don't know. Sound did go out though.
Disgust is very useful in that it draws our attention to the fact that perhaps a moral boundary has been crossed. But we should, in my view, we should never base our morals on disgust alone, because disgust did not evolve as a litmus test of morality. It evolved to keep us safe from parasites. So the two are not always the same. What disgusts us is not necessarily immoral. And a lot of people rely more heavily on what they call the moral intuitions, and that's disgust.
Do any of you have any questions for our author? Yes, ma'am, in the pink.
First of all, thank you very much. It's very interesting. After doing so much research, have you seen that you've changed your diet in any way?
I am not at all disgust sensitive. And that's probably why I was able to write this book. It's very interesting. The scientists that are drawn to this field tend to fall into one of two groups. Either they are so disgust sensitive. In one case, the scientist actually has to have all of his graduate students program the disgusting imagery because he will just gag. So some of them are attracted to the field because they realize that this emotion has so much power over them.
Right.
And so that's the reason they wanted to study it. Others are like myself, and they're just very hard to disgust.
Yes, all the way in the back.
I have a question why certain cultures seem to tolerate such levels of
there are a lot more toilets than are actually used. People that have a toilet will fill out the heel and not use the toilet. And do you have an explanation as to how certain cultures seem to tolerate such a high level of what we would definitely consider disgust in North America?
People around the world, research shows, are disgusted by the same things. However, that doesn't mean that we're all disgusted to the same level. Culture most definitely plays a role in, your disgust sensitivity. So you basically have kind of a central template, but it gets modified from one culture to the next.
Yes, ma'am?
I was a little puzzled about the barnacle because if 100% of the crabs in the Mediterranean have them,
It's like shaker barnacles.
I'd always thought that parasites were kind of very careful not to kill off all the possible.
Right. Lynn just asked the question of how can the parasite colonize 100% of crabs in the Mediterranean and not basically go extinct, which is a very good question. And what I said is that they parasitize 100% of the crabs in certain parts of the Mediterranean, so that they're able to actually continue to, regenerate.
Sir?
That's insane.
I'm curious about the New York Times article that said that having more variations in your microflora makes you actually stronger and more resistant.
I would think so.
And with fecal transplant successes that have come up recently, could it be that we're overly sensitized to this cleansing of
That's
our body?
the hygiene hypothesis.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, there's a lot of people who think that is indeed the case, that you really need to encounter a lot of different microbes early in life to fine-tune your immune system and to be able to tell, basically good bacteria from the enemy. And so now that we're raising children in much more hygienic environments, they're not being exposed to as many germs, so they don't have as rich and varied a microbiota. And then on top of everything else, the antibiotics, the antibiotics are a big issue because they kill off a lot of bacteria. Now, normally, after you finish taking antibiotics, frequently a lot of the many bacteria will return to the gut, will repopulate the gut, but often not as many organisms return. And new research is actually showing that lack of diversity in your gut bacteria can correlate with obesity. So that people who are obese are more likely to have less diverse gut bacteria. And children who've had 7 or more cycles of antibiotic treatment in childhood, by their teen years, they're about 3 pounds heavier than children who have not had as many antibiotics. And that doesn't sound like that big a difference, but as we age, the difference becomes cumulative. So by middle age, the difference can be actually quite considerable. And one of the scientists in the field said, that the antibiotics we take in childhood may determine our body mass index for life.
Dang.
I'm wondering if some of the microbes are causing epigenetic changes, and also are there recommendations for how to change cat litter?
Okay, for changing cat litter, I guess just wear gloves. Yeah, right. Yeah. So one of your questions is, are gut bacteria causing epigenetic changes? What epigenetic changes means is changes in how our genes are expressed. So the genes themselves aren't changed. It's just whether they get turned on or off, or how much of a particular chemical gets produced. And I think it's a very good guess that gut microbiota do cause epigenetic changes, because we know that they play a critical role in the wiring of the brain in the first weeks of life. In fact, there is a new, soon-to-be published study that blew my mind. Basically, the scientist who did this research, his name is Emran Mayer. He's on the West Coast. He can look at an MRI of your brain and tell you what are the most abundant gut bacteria that are inside you. And apparently the gut bacteria influence the volume and density of your gray matter, and they also influence the white matter tracts that connect different regions of the brain.
I'm going to go buy some acidophilus today. I'm going straight to Whole Foods. Sir?
Yes?
I was equally interested about the section in your book that discussed the parasitic wasp that stings some kind of an orb weaver or something in South America. Is that right? Anyway, the larva, what chemicals? I'm just perplexed by the concept of dramatically altering behavior, like the way a web is formed, and making some kind of a three-dimensional change in that just through chemistry. That's really intriguing to me, and I'm wondering if scientists are looking into those chemicals that are released for potential psychopharmacological applications or things like that.
Well, certainly in the case of our gut microbiome, the gut bacteria, scientists are now very busily screening bacteria, because most bacteria do not produce neurotransmitters or other psychoactive compounds, but some do. And so they are trying to identify these particular strains, and then they are sort of cloning the chemicals they produce, and they're testing them on rodents. And the hope is that they may find chemicals, perhaps ones that work a lot better than, for example, the Prozac or Valium or whatever, chemicals we're using today, but ones that our bodies actually produces and recognize. So there's a very, very fertile area of research is screening gut microbes for those that are producing psychoactive compounds. Yeah, the pharmaceutical industry is hugely interested in that.
Folks, I'm going to have to cut off the live stream presentation right now because we're out of time, but I want you to all stay seated, and we'll ask some more questions. But I just wanted to remind the live stream audience, give us a call. We'll get a book autograph for you, and we'll ship it to you. And that will be good night to you, and the rest of you can finish asking your questions. Thank you.
Very, very good. Very good.
Hi, my name is Sassy Cudel, and I'm an undergraduate at the Summer Institute of Medical Ignorance program here at the University of Arizona. I decided to make my video on parasitology in medicine, and specifically its misdiagnosis. For some people, parasites are a stuff of nightmares. These organisms take up residence in their human hosts, hide, and feed off of the nutrients of the person, causing minor ailments as well as serious and sometimes life-threatening illnesses. So for my beginning question, how and why are these parasites being misdiagnosed? These microscopic creatures can be passed from person to person and in contact with contaminated clothing, bedding, and food. In some cases, parasites can also be passed through mosquitoes such as malaria, and even barefoot on soil such as hookworm is called in the tropical areas the fiery serpent. Many people think parasites may be acquired only in developing and third world countries, or as a parting gift on an exotic vacation. However, a new report from the Center of Disease Control and Prevention finds these critters very much alive in the United States. Millions of Americans develop parasitic infections, and symptoms often go unnoticed or misdiagnosed due to the similarity to minor infections such as nausea, dizziness, fever, and pain. After basic care and tests are conducted, many of these parasites remain undetected and are classified as idiopathic diseases. Scientists at the CDC have discovered cancer cells originating in a common tapeworm may take place en route in people with weakened immune systems, causing cancer-like tumors. In the New England Journal of Medicine, they raise concerns that other similar cases may be misdiagnosed as human cancer, especially in less developed countries where immune-suppressing illnesses like HIV are widespread. In 2003, the CDC took part in helping diagnose biopsies from lung tumors and lymph nodes.
What does that say? Scientists at Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have discovered cancer cells originating in a common tapeworm may take root in people with weakened immune systems. I have one, causing cancer-like tumors. It is the first known case of a person becoming ill from cancer cells that arose in a parasite. In this case, Hymenolapis nana, the dwarf tapeworm. What do I know?
Of a 41-year-old man who was HIV positive. The tumors look similar to human cancer, but the CDC lab studies revealed the cancer cells were not human. The revelation solved a 3-year hunt for the cause of the man's illness. A similar parasite transmitted by the
This is also
kissing
weird because the kissing bug is related to the stinking bug, and if I'm not mistaken, they are, made?
bug can cause Chagas disease and can stay dormant and undetected up to 20 years. It can later manifest itself in a congestive heart failure after showing symptoms of swollen eyelids and rashes. As parasitic infections are rising in Western medicine, so are the misdiagnoses. In third world countries, parasitic infections are often caught early due to how common it is, while in the United States, it's taken up to surgery to realize what exactly they're dealing with. Since the misdiagnosis of parasites is becoming more and more common in Western medicine, is it the ignorance of the physicians to blame for not suspecting parasites in the first place because they reside in a first world country, or is it technology to blame for not detecting it?
Both. And I don't even think it's just technology. I think it's
people everywhere are recommending GoodRx.